Before going to the next project, I wanted to introduce to another module or library, which is called requests library. This is not the class of Flask that you get from the Flask module. This is a different library or different module altogether. What is this library? This is an HTTP library for Python, and the important part is that it is used to send HTTP requests and receive HTTP responses. Now a question to you, how we have been doing this so far without the requests library? You can pause the video and think of the answer. I hope you are done. So far we have been using Postman tool to send HTTP requests and receive HTTP responses. But that is not how we implement APIs in production or in a real life use case. What would happen is that there would be multiple APIs which would be calling multiple other APIs, and nowhere will be using Postman because the requests might come from a web application or a batch application or can be a streaming application also. So that's where this requests library or the requests module is used. The installation is pretty straightforward. We'll use pip3 install requests or pip install requests, and then we import the entire module itself, which is requests module. As mentioned earlier, don't confuse the requests library with Flask's request class. Sorry, this is not library, it should be class. Let me change it. So it is not same as Flask's request class. Using the request class, what we do is we get the URL and we used to see, or we used to parse what the client has sent. So we use this request class to analyze the URL endpoint and find multiple information from there, like what is the base URL, what is the query string, what query variables have been sent, etc. But the requests library is different, and we can use this library to send SSL based request. We can use this for authentication and authorization also, and we can use this library for streaming data also. Alright, so far we have been using Postman to send the HTTP requests and receive the HTTP responses in the Postman tool itself. And what we have been doing, we have been opening the tool and sending the request to the Python Flask application, and the application would send the response back to the Postman tool. But now what we are going to do, we are going to replace this Postman tool using another Python application, which would be a Python Flask application, or it can be a simple Python application also. It can be a Python batch application, it can be a Python streaming application, or anything of that sort. It does not have to be necessarily Python Flask application as long as you use the requests module or the requests library. So we'll be using these libraries in all the Python Flask application that we are going to use in future. Because what would happen is that this Python program would be calling another Python program using the requests module. Likewise, the second Python Flask program can call another Python API or another Flask API using the same requests library itself. So this is what we are going to use in future. So we send a request and get a response. Now there are few things that you can send and there are few things that you can receive. First thing is that recall that using Postman, we can mention what method we want to use. It can be get, post, put, delete, etc. And we can send query string also. We can send Flask based query parameters like using the Angular bracket. We can send query string using question mark and then ampersand also. Then we can send data using the body also. It can be a JSON data, it can be raw data, etc. And the same things can be done using this library or this module also. So after we import this library, we use requests.request method to send HTTP method, the URL and the parameters. Now the method that you see here, this is an HTTP method which can be either get, put, post, delete, patch, etc. And the URL would be the URL endpoint followed by the parameters if you have to pass any. So let's say I want to pass two variables or two parameters. What will I do is that I'll use a variable like parm and I'll put those parameters and their corresponding value in this parm dictionary, and then I'll send it using the params keyword. Now here params is a keyword and parm is a variable. It could have been ABCD also. Data is a keyword which is used to send data, like you use the body in Postman to send data. And we can send cookies also using this particular method, which is request method. Now, if you do not want to use the method here, let's say, we can use individual methods also, like requests.get.put, requests.post, requests.patch, etc. And if we use the methods in with the requests class itself, then we just pass the URL and the parameter. Obviously, we can send cookies and other information also, but we do not pass the HTTP method anymore. Then we can send session data using requests.session method. So these are the most common methods and variables that we use. Now the question is, how do we get the response? So in Postman, we used to get the response in the tool itself using JSON or array or whichever way we used to send it from the Python Flask application. In case of requests, how do we do that? So typically this is how we handle request and response. We define a variable or an object, and we use the requests module to send the request to an API using the URL endpoint and the parameters. And then the output is actually received in this variable or in this object, which is resp in this case. Obviously, it can be anything. It can be A, B, C, or name, whatever. What happens is that once we receive the output or once we receive the response, there are some variables and methods that can be used to get data and few other information also. For example, we can use rest.status_code variable to get the HTTP status code, which can be 200, 400, 500, and so on. Why we get the status code? Because using this, we can actually put a logic to process the remaining portion of the program. We get the headers using resp.headers variable. We get the cookies data using resp.cookies variable. And if you actually want to get the data, then we can use resp.json method. Note that this is a method, so you'll have to pass the open and close brackets. If you want to get the response in JSON, then only you'll have to use resp.json. If you want to get the data in text, then you can use resp.text. And if you want to see the actual content, you can use resp.content also. So this is a small introduction to the requests library. And this is what we are going to use. One of the most famous libraries that is used with Python Flask application for API handling. Let's go ahead and do some hands-on. What am I going to do? We will use two very simple Flask applications, but instead of using Postman, we'll be sending the request using a Python application to the Flask API. Let's go ahead and do that. So what have I done here is that I have created two Flask programs. One is the request API.py. It is a plain and simple Flask application. So what am I doing is that I'm handling this get cust data URL endpoint using this cust_data API. And this API can send only get method. I am capturing the customer ID in this particular variable, and I'm opening this finance_customer_data.csv, which I have used earlier also. And if you find the customer, then break out of the loop. If you don't, then send a message that customer is not found. It's a very simple application. And then there's one more application, which is requests client.py. And I have not coded anything here. This does not have to be a Flask application. It can be if, let's say, you are implementing an API using this program, then it has to be a Flask application also. But I'll keep this program as a plain and simple Python program. The only difference would be that I'll be using the requests library. So first, let us get the response. Now, how do I get the response? I use the requests.get or requests.request, and here I'll have to pass the method, which is get. And then I will have to use the URL endpoint, which would be loopback IP address 127.0.0.1 and the port number 8000. Let me start this application. And this is the URL. And along with it, I'll have to use this endpoint also, which is get cust data. All right, now URL is done. How do I pass the variables? Let's try passing the variable using Flask method, wherein I'll just use the customer ID. And let's print resp and let's see what do we get. Okay, let's send this, and it says 404, the request URL or endpoint was not found. Why that is the case? Because we are using Flask's request class to capture the passing argument. So we'll have to pass it using a query string. So let's do that. Okay, so this is the query string, and now let's send the request, and we are getting a response of 200, which is working. As you can see, the resp variable or the resp object would contain only the response, and I had shown you a few variables. If you type dot, you can see what things are there. This is the status code. So let's print the status code, and let's print the content using this content variable. Let's pass it, and it says customer not found. Why that is the case? Because customer ID 123 is not there. And let's use a customer which is there. Now let's send it, and it also says customer not found. And why is the case? How do you debug that? You know how to debug, but we can use some print statement also. So what will I do? I'll print the customer ID, and I'll see whether we get into this loop or not. So again, response 200, but customer is not found. Let's go here and see the printing, which is this request API, and it says customer ID has been sent, but it is not matching. The problem here is that we'll have to convert this customer ID to a string variable. There is one more problem. I did not split the line actually. Now let's see. And I'm getting this entire line. So it is working right now. And if I go here, and now it is matching, right? So again, it was a very small error, but that's fine. So let's go to the requests method. Now what is happening here is that I'm printing this rest.content. Now as you can see in the output here, there are two outputs for two different programs. It is sending it in the data variable, and it is in binary format. That's what the content variable contains. It contains the output in binary format. Let's use all the three that we have, the content, text, and JSON that I have just discussed. Okay, so the response code is 200, content is in binary, text is in text, which is actually a string, and the JSON is actually in JSON. The data is in the data variable, which is fine. Now there are some other outputs also, like header and cookies. Let's print those. So I'm printing this response headers in the resp.headers variable and resp.cookies variable. So let's print this out, and let's see the header. Now as you can see, the header contains a lot of information. For example, the date, the version of Python, the version of Flask, what is the content type, it is an application or JSON, what is the length of the content, 220 bytes, whether the connection is there or not, it is closed. So these are some of the headers which are sent. If you want, you can send customized headers also from the server, from the API. And cookies, it does not have any cookie as such, because obviously the server did not send any cookie. This is how the response variable gives us. And of course, you might be questioning, do I use the endpoint like this? The answer is of course no, because every time whenever your customer ID changes, then you'll have to change this endpoint. Of course, this is not a good idea. So what did I tell you? There's a keyword parameter called params, and here you'll pass the arguments or the variables that you want to pass, and I'm naming it as parm. You can name it anything, and parm has to be a dictionary with the keyword that you are going to send, that is cust ID, and its value, which is 201006, and then we pass the parm variable using the params keyword. Now let's execute this, and we are getting the same output. I'll remove all the other things and just print the JSON and execute it. This is the response, Obviously, the entire record has come. That is perfectly fine, but it is there in the data keyword, right? In the data attribute. Let's use a different customer 2010078, and let's use the params variable right now, and I should be able to see the output. Now, do you hard code the value here? The answer is of course no. And if it is an API, let's say if requests client.py is an API, you'd capture this customer ID from another query string. Or if it is a file, you will read the file and send the customer ID to this endpoint by reading the file. And this would be a dynamic variable. So this is how, using this requests module, I can implement a Flask client also. So far we have been using Postman, but going forward we'll be using this requests module. And as you can see, the program that I have used as a client is not a Flask application. It's a plain and simple Python application.